This is The Camp with Zach Heilprin and the Athletics' Jesse Temple.
Yes, welcome into The Camp. I'm Zach Heilprin. That's the Athletics' Jesse Temple. Badgers getting ready to take on Georgia Southern on Saturday morning, an 11 a.m. kick. I'm sure the place will be packed. Everyone very excited about Georgia Southern coming to town.
Hey, they're 2-0, Zach.
They are. I'm not saying they're a bad team. All I'm saying is I don't think people are overly excited about Georgia Southern coming to town, an 11 a.m. kick, coming off a loss to Washington State. That's all I'm saying. Either way, we are going to be out tomorrow night at Monk's in Sun Prairie for Temple and Heilprin. Come out and see us. You can also listen on Zone Madison. You can find the podcast wherever you are. Also going to be posting video probably, it depends. Depends what I do at Monk's. If I have a few drinks, then it probably won't be until Friday morning. If I don't, then it'll probably be Thursday night. But the segments we posting up on our YouTube page. If you didn't know about it, and based on some of our podcast numbers, there are new listeners here. So just want to make everybody aware we do have a YouTube page. You can watch me and Jesse do this on if that's more your preference. And so, yeah, make sure to check that out. But again, Temple and Heilprin live from Monk's in Sun Prairie, 6 to 7 every Thursday. All right, let's get into this. Jesse had an opportunity to chat with the guys yesterday. We got to talk with Luke Fickell on Monday. There are a number of topics and a number of ways we can go with this, but I think it's probably most important to start with Braelon Allen because he did not speak after the game on Saturday night. That game came with him carrying it just 7 times, the fewest he has in a game that he started. He had 20 yards, second fewest in a game he started. He did touch the ball 13 times because he got 6 catches, but those 6 catches went for 12 yards. So it was not an overly explosive day for Braelon Allen, and I know the numbers of touches that he got probably not ideal for him. But what was his mindset like when he had a chance to talk with him on Tuesday?
I asked him what his thoughts were after the fact, knowing that he only got 7 carries, which is the fewest carries that he's had since he became a regular in the rotation 2 seasons ago. And he said that he was disappointed, but he was more so disappointed in the fact that Wisconsin didn't win the game. He wasn't going to say anything about the staff and his usage rate, but he wants to be an impact player, which is what he said. He'd like to be able to have more of an impact. And the other thing is some of those rushing numbers are mitigated by the receptions, but he had the 6 catches and it only went for 12 yards. And I also asked him about that. How do you generate some more out of that? And I thought it was interesting because he said, if you look at what I've done so far, and I'm paraphrasing, but it's essentially been all swing passes and checkdowns. And he said, I think I showed in camp that I can affect the game as a pass catcher in a bunch of different ways. I made catches down the field. I can be utilized over the middle. And so I think everybody knows how talented Braelon is. And everybody knows that if you want to win, you've got to have more than 7 carries for 20 yards and 6 catches for 12 yards. So it's figuring out ways to affect the game. But we know Washington State also tried to stop the run. It's something that Luke Fickell said on Monday. On the other hand, every team ever has tried to stop the run against Wisconsin for 30 years, and they've managed to have some success in a lot of those situations. So I think they've got to figure this out because if you want to have success, you got to have a great passing game, but you've got to have that strong running game that we saw in week 1.
So we hear guys talk and say the right things all the time, but what kind of vibe did he give you?
I didn't get sort of the negative. I know we're trying to parse out body language and things like that, but these are the only opportunities that we have to be around these guys. I mean, I can remember late last season, right after the whole the message board post about Braelon in Michigan, and then I think we talked to him the Monday after. We talked to him after that game. I think it was the Iowa game, but we also talked to him the Monday after. And you just kind of got this sense that whole season it was rough on everybody, but that was a very difficult week for him, kind of downbeat a little bit. I didn't get that sense at all from Braelon. I thought he was upbeat. He was willing to answer questions. He was very thoughtful. And I do think that these guys believe it's going to come together. There's a lot of optimism, maybe hard to see from fans after what happened on Saturday, but I think he is ready to show everything he's got in the tool bag, if you will.
And you got that vibe from all the players, you think?
I really did. I'll be honest. And even Tanner Mordecai, and I know we've said here the last couple of weeks, Tanner is somebody who would be just fine if he probably didn't have to talk to us. He's all about the ball, but I think he gave some really good answers, and his confidence is, this is another topic we could discuss, but I was asking them how close the guys on offense, how close are they to being the offense they believe they can? And he gave a very good answer that he said, I think we're close and we can feel it. We can smell it. And it feels like this group is ready to break out. And he said, maybe it could be this week against Georgia Southern. I certainly, if you're a fan, you would hope of all weeks, this would be one of those weeks. But I do think this group early in this season, based on having been around them, they appear to be very optimistic and very upbeat, despite the fact they're coming off a tough loss.
Yeah, it's tough because you're right. You only get to spend so much time around them, so you don't know exactly how they're feeling away from the spotlight. But I think that probably goes back. And again, I'm not saying it's right. I'm not saying it's wrong. I'm going to do my little Luke Fickle thing here. I'm not saying it's better. I'm not saying it's worse. I'm not saying it's exactly the same. But it feels like because of the way the coaching staff goes about it, the way the program goes about it, keeping the energy up is paramount, and to keep guys locked in is much needed. And I think that is probably a strength of this staff. And I guess we'll see what happens on Saturday. I have no idea, but I think I go back to what Jake Chaney said after the game, down 24-6 or 24-9. Are they coming back from that in prior years and making it a game? I'm not sure they are. So it's not that they quit ever before. I just don't know if they had the mindset to go back and, hey, it's okay, we're fine. We're gonna get back in this game. And I thought that they did have that mindset on Saturday night, and it sounds like they kind of felt that they are that what they're saying is not just lip service.
Yeah, and I think another thing to consider is that there is still so much newness to this. This group has only played 2 games together. I think they're still learning what works and what doesn't and adjusting to the scheme. And if you go back to even last year when everything was spiraling out of control, that felt, and I think we can acknowledge, it was a situation where, like, and Jack Nelson has said this on multiple times in the last 8 or 9 months, like it felt like you were kind of banging your head against a wall and going back to the well and doing the same thing. Like, they've been doing that for so long and it wasn't working. And to me, this is such a different situation where you're still learning. It's still very new. And if something doesn't work for one game, that's not indicative of the way the entire season is going to go. And so I feel like that is reflective of the behavior we're seeing from guys when they come out to talk to us.
So Braelon Allen, he's still on pace for about 85 catches. Do we think he gets there?
He went up, actually, right? Oh no, he had 7.
No. He was at 91. Now he's at 84.
Yeah, I wasn't a math major, but 6.5 a game is pretty good.
Do you think he's gonna break Brian Calhoun's record?
I do. I also think he's gonna get more than 150 yards receiving. They're gonna have to figure out some ways to. And I understand that Phil Longo views this as you get the ball out in space to good athletes, and it's almost like a rushing attempt. I mean, you're throwing him the ball behind the line of scrimmage in some of these cases, or right at there, but 2 yards isn't going to cut it.
Yeah, I mean, he's on pace for 84 catches for 160 yards. It's not exactly probably what they had in mind when they got into that, but again, it's part of the offense. And you mentioned it there a little bit. You're going to be writing a story about it, the offense not being that far away from clicking. And I kind of said this before we went on the air, and it sounds like the guys felt this too, is kind of marry what went well in the opener against Buffalo and what went well against Washington State, put that together, and you have to feel at least somewhat confident that you can reach where they think they want to be.
That's exactly what Chimere Dike said. You look at the first game, they had 312 yards rushing. It's the most of the Badgers had in a game in 2 years, but the passing game wasn't, in terms of especially big plays, explosive plays, wasn't what the Badgers would have wanted it. And then in game 2, I think Tanner Mordecai afforded himself very well. Yeah, he lost 2 fumbles, but his left tackle got beat, and I don't put that on Mordecai. He showed great demeanor in the second half. I think it'd be very easy for a quarterback. You lose a fumble in the end zone, you go down 24-6. Everybody folds up shop. But that third quarter, they had 2 touchdown drives. But the running game it wasn't there. It was virtually non-existent. So can you figure out a way where Tanner Mordecai is clicking, with his wide receivers, but you've got a really sound run game. I know Phil Longo his philosophy is you take what the defense gives you, but you got to be able to merge the two. And then I think this group can be successful. It is interesting though about trying to consider, well, how far away are they actually? It's easy to say we're really close. And I asked Luke Fickell the same question on Monday, and that's exactly what he said. I wouldn't expect anybody to say, well, we're so far away, we're going to be terrible on offense this year. But I do wonder exactly how close they are to getting it all right. And I think it's going to take a little bit of time, even though fans may not want to hear that.
For sure. Going to the turnover aspect of this with Tanner Mordecai, I think that was one of my biggest questions coming in. Could he, we talked about it in the offseason, the interceptions. Where do you stand when it comes to the turnovers that he's been charged with, right? He's got 4 turnovers through 2 games. And I've seen certain people try and pull numbers out of thin air to compare that to Graham Mertz, who averaged 1 point something a game, and now Tanner Mordecai is averaging 2 something a game. It feels a little disingenuous to put those numbers together, and it feels a little wrong to do it. Trying to compare 2 games to 25 games in terms of the last 2 years, I feel like it's extremely, extremely early for anyone to try and draw conclusions to Tanner Mordecai's numbers in that respect.
100% agree. I think I feel better after watching the Washington State game about, and this is more throwing it down the field and not getting picked off, because we saw what happened in week 1. Like when it was off target, which you don't want to be, I think about the couple passes late in the game to Bryson Green. You want to give him a chance, but it wasn't like, wow, that was a horribly underthrown, wobbly pass, and the defense dropped a sure interception. I think he did a very good job in that regard of not putting himself in a bad situation when he threw the ball. Obviously, he had the 2 lost fumbles, but if your left tackle is going to get beat like that, and that's your blind side, sure, you need to have awareness as a quarterback, but there's not much time. And if someone's going to have a clear shot on you, it's difficult for me to put that on the quarterback. So I don't look at it and say, oh, he's averaging 2 turnovers a game, this is a turnover machine. I actually have more confidence coming out of that he'll be able to generally take care of the ball and at least give Wisconsin opportunities.
Yeah, I'm trying to think back the number of interceptable passes. I don't even know if that's a word, interceptable, but passes that potentially could have been intercepted by Washington State. And in my mind, I could think of only one, and it was the back shoulder he tried to throw to Chimray down the left side, and the guy got his hands on it. I think that was in the fourth quarter. There weren't too many opportunities for guys to get their hands on balls on Saturday. It was almost always overthrown as opposed to underthrown, and that's certainly what you want. And a lot of those balls hit wide receivers' hands. Not that they would have been easy catches by any stretch, but they were at least right there potentially to make a play. I think that's going to continue to get better and better. I do think they're going to be able to hit on them. We saw a couple of them on Saturday night. I think that the deep ball has to be a part of this offense when teams are going to play you the way that Washington State did. They absolutely have to be. And I'm not, you can ask, were the wide receivers even open? I thought they had steps on guys, quite a bit. They had steps on guys. And so I think there's a possibility for this passing game to even ramp up the explosive plays, certainly further than what we've seen through these first 2 games. We saw a couple of them, but I think there's more to this.
The other thing is it comes down to finishing, because they had 3 drives where they moved the ball down the field. 2 of them, they got into the red zone. 1, they got to the 25, and then they got stuck. And obviously Nathaniel Vakos came out there and went 3 for 3 on field goals in the first half. So it wasn't like this offense was going 3 and out and was totally ineffective. They were doing some good things early, but obviously when you're trading touchdowns for field goals, you're never going to have a chance. So I think that's another thing too, that at least is a moderately encouraging sign, but you've got to be able to finish. And that all goes back to this idea of being consistent all the way through.
Yeah. And I know that some people are pointing towards Phil Longo's red zone offense from last year. And I just don't think that, again, a little too early. And it's not, I mean, if you're not able to run the ball, you're going to struggle. I think Wisconsin itself is going to struggle to score. If you're not able to run the ball in the red zone, if you're not able to run the ball anywhere in the game, you're going to struggle to score in the red zone and try and finish drives. I think that's just what it is. And so we'll see if that continues to be an issue. Saturday obviously was huge because you're just trying to trade touchdowns for field goals, and it's not going to work out in your favor. One thing before we move on, because I want to talk about turnovers on defense, they're the lack of, and I know we talked about that a little bit, but I know you wrote about it. Are you at all surprised that we have not seen Keontez Lewis on the field at any point Saturday night, and really only until the game was out of question against Buffalo?
I am, but I'm also basing that on what we saw during the preseason practices that were open to us when we were watching. And there were, I believe, 9 open practices. 8 of them were the first 8 practices, and then there was 1 open practice on a scrimmage day about 2 weeks before the season opener. He was part of what essentially was a 6-player rotation at wide receiver. So he was on the left side where Chimere Dike was, and then Bryson Green and CJ Williams were on the right side. And then you had Will Pauling and Skylar Bell in the slot with a little bit of Vinny Anthony. But at that point, I didn't have reason to believe that there was such a stark drop off, at least in the coaching staff's mind, between whatever the top 5 was and where Keontez was. And maybe some of that has to do with this. If we put him on the field, then that means we don't have Chimere on the field, although you can obviously shuffle some things around and put him on the other side, but then you wouldn't have a Bryson Green, and we saw some of that big play potential. So we haven't had a chance really to ask about this, but I'd be certainly curious to know what the thought process was, because wide receivers coach Mike Brown has said all along that ideally he would love to have 6 wide receivers. Now, he's also been honest and said that just because you want to have 6 doesn't mean you're going to play that many. But I think what Keontez did on the field last season showed that he can be a deep threat, and he had multiple moments in practice, whether it was the spring or the preseason, where you saw some of that ability. So I am definitely surprised to see the way that his snap count has decreased here early this season.
It's not night and day in terms of the speed, but he is, based on their offseason workouts, the fastest guy in that room. The whole speed club that Brady Collins would put out. And I know maybe I shouldn't say fastest guy in the room based on what's up?
Will Pauling's the fastest guy maybe ever of all time.
He's fast, but you go back and look at the spring and those mile per hours, and nobody topped Keontez Lewis in the spring. Now, I know they ran 40s in fall, and you had a chance when you went to, what was that, squat day or squat fest, that he kind of talked about some of the guys' 40 numbers Brady Collins did. But he's got some speed. He's got the ability to go over the top. But again, I don't think that was necessarily an issue for them on Saturday night. They had steps on guys, and they were just a little bit off. Now, maybe if you had an extra 0.2 of a mile per hour, either 0.2 of a mile per hour faster, maybe that ball is just falling right in the hands. I don't know. But I also will say this. It appeared, based on, and maybe this is just because of the guys that were going to be out there, but against Buffalo, Keontez was on the side where Bryson Green and CJ Williams are. He was not on the left side. On the left side was Quincy Burrows, where Chimere Dike is when it's the first team offense. And then if you go back to Saturday night, we saw rotation at, between Skylar Bell and Will Pauling. We saw the rotation between Bryson Green and CJ Williams. Vinny Anthony even got some snaps in the slot. Chimere, until he got hurt on that final drive, no one else played the left side. 0. It's not that he played every snap, but formationally, anytime there was somebody lined up on the left side, he was the only one. It seems pretty clear to me that they want him on the field as much as possible. Yeah. And it's not going to be a timeshare arrangement like it is on the right side. Now, does that mean that Bryson Green or that Keontez Lewis shouldn't get any reps? I don't know that. I will say that he was dinged up in practice. We know that he was not a full participant. You talked about that scrimmage 2 weeks before the season. He did not take part in that. There was a couple practices down in or at least one practice down in Platteville that he was held out of. And so I think that may have played a role in it, but it is a little bit of surprise that you've seen that, or maybe have not seen him involved at all. So again, that is a question that we'd love to ask. And I think that's probably something that's worthwhile asking to Luke Fickell the next time we get a chance to speak with him, just because it was thought to be the top 6, and that was going to be the 6, and it just hasn't been that way to this point. So, all right, moving on to the turnovers on the defensive side of the ball, Wisconsin has not forced a single one yet. They are -5 in the turnover battle so far this year. It reminds me a little bit of 2021. Now, they didn't have zero, but they didn't turn the ball over nearly, or the cause turnovers nearly as much as they probably wanted to and should have. And then they just came in bunches. But I know you wrote about it today. What do the numbers say about this start for Wisconsin?
Well, I'm glad you mentioned 2021 because I was talking to Jake Chaney about this on Tuesday, and that was the first thing that he went to. And I went back and looked, and they had 4 turnovers through the first 6 games. Then they had 5 turnovers against Purdue, and the floodgates opened, and they finished with 24 turnovers, 24 takeaways. They had like 20 takeaways over the last 7 games. It was ridiculous. But for this year, it is very surprising. They've got no turnovers, obviously, through the first 2 games. You mentioned the -5 in turnover margin. The only team in the country that's worse is Nebraska at -6. And right now, Wisconsin's one of only 8 teams in the FBS that has yet to force a turnover. And historically speaking, Wisconsin has done a very good job defensively of forcing takeaways and changing momentum of the game. The only season and I went back to looking at box scores all the way to 1995. And before then, it's kind of tough to find the box scores. But the only other season dating to that time where Wisconsin went the first 2 games without a turnover was in 2012. And that team actually went the first 3 games without forcing a turnover. So some of this is, I mean, yes, it's an anomaly. And I think what's interesting is when I asked Luke Fickell this question on Monday, he pointed out that he queued up the first defensive series and showed it to the players on Sunday. And he showed them that of the first 8 plays, there were 3 opportunities for takeaways. And to me, this speaks to, it's a combination. There is bad luck involved here. Absolutely. Now, some would say you make your own luck. However, when a center snaps the ball over Cameron Ward's head, it takes 1 bounce and goes right back to him. You can't control that as a defense. On the other hand, and that was one of the situations on those first 8 plays. I think it was the second snap, it bounced over him and he ended up able to get rid of it. But there was a 3rd down play. It was like 3rd and 13, and Ward threw the ball down into the flat, I think, to Nakia Watson, and Watson was able to pick up 12 yards. This is something that both Fickell talked about and Muma Jongmeta, that Nakia had the ball out off to the side, and Muma came in from behind and just wasn't able to get his hand on the ball. Like, that is a takeaway opportunity. Ricardo Hallman, it would have been an amazing interception, but he broke on the ball on 3rd down right before the punt, couldn't come up with the pick. Obviously, there were those situations in the second half backed up in the end zone, it should have been an absolute debacle for Washington State. I don't know how the Badgers didn't manage to get any points, but
it was an absolute disaster. It was they avoided disaster on 3 straight plays. 2 for sure avoided disaster, maybe not on the other one, but he hands it off to Watson. It pops back up and it pops right back into his hands. It's insane. That's insane.
And Nakia, I think what it was, he ran right into his right tackle and the ball came out. And then obviously the other one, it snapped over his head again. And Ward looked as nonchalant as you could possibly be for what I think would be the most stressful situation ever. Just kind of jogged back to the end zone and managed to throw the ball away before he got drilled. So it's a combination, but I think it goes to kind of a larger, I don't know if issue is the right word, but it comes down to consistency of execution. And Muma talked about this of, you want to perform at a consistently high level, and that gives you an opportunity on every play to have some success. So I don't want to make too much of like some of those plays against Washington State, but it is noteworthy that you're 2 games through, you don't have any turnovers. That's extremely unusual for Wisconsin. When Jim Leonard was the defensive coordinator here, they averaged about 2 takeaways per game. So I think they're pretty confident that it's going to come, but obviously it hasn't yet. And when you can't get even one of those, it makes a huge difference.
Yeah. And Georgia Southern right now is even in turnover margin. So they've turned it over, but they've also been able to create some as well. So that to me it's going to be an interesting one. They've thrown, they've thrown a couple picks and had a couple of fumbles. So I feel like you're going to get an opportunity. You're going to have some opportunities this weekend, and maybe this is the weekend that it shifts in Wisconsin's favor. We're talking about Washington State here a little bit. There was a couple of questions that I didn't get to the other day in terms of Twitter questions, and I wanted to ask you about this one because I think it's at least an interesting topic to at least think about. I don't necessarily know if I agree with it, but I want to get your take on it. Mike actually, I guess it wasn't a Twitter question. It was a follow-up from Monday when we were talking about the strength and how good Washington State actually is. And he said, to add on to your discussion about the quality of Wazzu in yesterday's podcast, do you think the Cougars are the second best team on Wisconsin's schedule? The Big Ten West is off to a horrible start all around.
When all is said and done, it's a distinct possibility. If Ohio State clearly number one, and then conversation for who's number two.
Iowa,
right. Initially, my thought would have gone to, all right, well, it's that 3-game October stretch. Illinois, Iowa, Illinois, not so good, as we've said. Barely beat Toledo, lost on the road to Kansas. Iowa, you expect defensively it to be a consistent battle. Offensively, they're falling below the drive for 325, shall we say, for Brian Ferentz. So I think that's a realistic way to look at it. It's almost a little too early for me to say, but it should also say something about the strength or perhaps lack thereof of Wisconsin's schedule this season and why, despite a loss, the Badgers should have an opportunity to put themselves in a position to compete for the Big Ten West Championship.
I think it's an interesting discussion. I think it's a really tough discussion and tough thing to think about because we don't know how good Washington State actually is because we don't know how good Wisconsin actually is. We know Colorado State, not great, but we'll see. I think Washington State, I said this on Monday, I think the talent that they have at quarterback, the talent that they have in rushing the passer and in the secondary, to be fair, there are some really good players on that team. And I think they have a shot to jump up and surprise some people. Are they on the level of USC? Probably not. Definitely not. But Cam Ward gives them a really good shot. And again, Wisconsin did a great job against Washington State's offense after the first four drives. They figured it out. They started playing a lot better, got pressure on him, made him try and have to figure things out. And he wasn't as good as he was before, but his lack of freaking out, like his complete calm in what has to be a storm was so impressive. Was so impressive that he didn't make the horrible mistake and like throw a ball into coverage that he shouldn't have, that maybe he would have the year before. And that's why Wisconsin doesn't have any turnovers. He was willing to throw, he was willing to hold on to it and take the sack. He was willing to throw it away. He just wasn't willing to throw it into harm's way very much.
Very much so. I also wonder on that turnover point, and I don't know whether there's any merit to this at all, but when you're going through a scheme change, whether that has anything to do with ability to be as effective this early on. Again, I don't know. Another thing, like 2 years ago, when Mike Tressel was the defensive coordinator at Cincinnati, now that Bearcats team went to the college football playoff, they led the country in takeaways with 34. They also had 6 dudes who were NFL draft picks and a 7th who led the team in picks, who's going to be an NFL draft pick. I do think it's an interesting juxtaposition, though, because if you just look at Wisconsin's roster in terms of kind of high-end pro type of talent, there's not as many of those, at least in my estimation, but that doesn't mean as a college team you can't be good enough to force some takeaways. So I don't know what all the reasons are for it. They just know they need to figure something out.
I'll also say all the guys that ended up getting drafted out of Cincinnati were not pro material when they showed up in Cincinnati. You know what I mean? Like they were developed. And so just because you maybe don't see it on this roster right now doesn't mean that it can't be developed into that, because that's what they did at Cincinnati. It's why they were so successful. It's not like they were recruiting 4 and 5 star guys. They were recruiting lower ranked guys and really coaching them up and getting overlooked guys and coaching them up. And so that was, I think, another part of why he was hired, why Luke Fickell was hired, is because he Chris McIntosh knows that you're not always going to be able to recruit, or you're not going to be able to recruit at a top 10 level every single year. So you have to get a guy who's a really good recruiter, but also a guy that can develop. And I think that's what probably they were focused on. But we'll see. I mean, Wisconsin has an opportunity to bounce back against Georgia Southern, a team that's 2-0, beat UAB 49-35 this past week. We know what Georgia Southern did last year, going into Nebraska and ending Scott Frost's tenure at Nebraska. I don't think the Luke Fickell tenure will end if Wisconsin loses this weekend, but it would be a huge hit to them. I know you're working on some other things this week. Darian Varner, right? You got an opportunity to chat with him for the first time ever? Right. Did he talk in the spring?
I talked to him on the phone after he committed, but this is the first time he was made available to the media here since he arrived in January.
So he got to travel and played a little bit against Washington State. Wasn't an overly huge impact, but where's he at?
Well, it's interesting because he talked about his injury last season. It was a Liz Frank injury in his left foot. And so it happened near the end of the season at Temple. He missed the last 2 games. He knew once he transferred here that he was going to miss the spring, but he also called it heartbreaking because that's a really difficult time. You've got all these transfers coming in. It's the most exciting offseason any of us can remember, and he's relegated to just watching from the side. Now, I think it sounds like he did a really good job of staying engaged, but what stood out most to me in my talk with him is that even when preseason practices started, he said, I thought I was 100%. And then I started watching myself on the film and I realized I'm not 100%. I mean, I think you take that for granted sometimes. Just because a guy is suddenly medically cleared, that doesn't mean he's going to be the player that he was last year. And he said it felt like it took him until almost the end of preseason practices to get some of that back. I do remember the first play that he had when he got in there. You might recall this as well. It was in Platteville. They were near the goal line and they stuck him in there and he flew off the edge. And if tackling was allowed, he might have destroyed the quarterback. And that was a play he said, yeah, I definitely remember it because I think that's what he can bring. And that's why Luke Fickell has said he brings this kind of level of explosiveness that is a little bit different from the defensive line. But it's taken him a little bit longer than certainly he would have anticipated to get back into the mix. And I don't know where things go from here. I think it's natural and easy to look at, my God, this guy was a first team all conference player at Temple last year. He was all over the backfield. You expect it to happen right away here. Well, it's a step up in competition, obviously. Competition even for reps. They played 7 defensive linemen in that game, and no one played more than 40 or 41 snaps. I think Gio Pius had the most at 40. So they're rotating a lot of guys, and that can also maybe make it a challenge to break through. But I think we're going to see it at some point from Varner. You don't have the type of season that he did last year without having a lot of talent, and I think it'll translate in some capacity.
I think we talked about this in the offseason, but his weight and what he did in 1 year at Temple and then lost a bunch of weight. I think he was playing like 260 last year, 265. Now he's put that weight back on. Do you think that impacts whether he can have an impact? Do you think that impacts whether he has a chance to make some chaos in the backfield at all?
Well, I asked him about that too. He said first of all, because he wasn't able to run and do a lot, he gained some natural weight by not being able to play ball and not.
I know
not
about that. I get that.
Yeah, I think they call that the freshman 25 for me, maybe. But he said he's 270, 275. He feels really good. And when I was asking Jake Chaney about it, he said, I know there are people out there who say he's kind of undersized for a defensive lineman or for what we ask him to do. But and maybe that was before more when he was at Temple last year, like when he was at 255, 260. He's like, but I don't see it. I mean, he's got everything you need. And he also said that it can be a little bit of a challenge on the defensive line playing in that dollar defense, the things that they ask people to do. And it's a little bit different from what he did at Temple. So I do think there is an adjustment period, but from a weight standpoint, now he seems to be at a pretty good place. I did wonder though, when he came here, like, how are you going to be effective in the Big Ten if you're 255, 260? Well, you're not, which is why he's now 270, 275.
Yeah. Interesting to see, because he's one of those transfers that we were expecting to make an impact at some point, and we'll see if that comes to fruition for him and the Badgers defense as they get ready to take on Georgia Southern on Saturday morning. We will be back tomorrow. Temple and Heilprin out at Monks and Sun Prairie, 6 to 7. You can listen to it live on Zone Madison. We'll also have the podcast wherever you get yours, and then also here on YouTube as well. All right, Jesse, thank you very much.
Thanks, Zach.
All right, there he is, Jesse Temple from The Athletic. You've been listening to The Camp.